A Long Walk to Water, Chapter 5. The Stories So Far. Every day Naya has to make 2 trips to the pond and back to fetch water, which means almost the whole day spent walking. Tired from walking and hungrier than he's ever been, Selva is delighted to come upon a bee's nest, which means one thing: honey. Southern Sudan, 2008. There was a big lake 3 days' walk away from Naya's village. Every year when the rain stopped and the pond near the village dried up, Naya's family moved from their home to a camp near the big lake. Naya's family did not live by the lake all year because of the fighting. Her tribe, the Nuer, often fought with the rival Dinka tribe over the land surrounding the lake. Men and boys were hurt and even killed when the 2 groups clashed. So Naya and the rest of her village lived at the lake only during the 5 months of the dry season. Naya's job at the lake camp was the same as at home, to fetch water. With her hands, she would dig a hole in the damp clay of the lake bed. She kept digging, scooping out handfuls of clay until the hole was as deep as her arm was long. The clay got wetter as she dug until at last water began to seep into the bottom of the hole. The water that filled the holes was filthy, more mud than liquid. It seeped in so slowly that it took a long time to collect even a few gourds full. Naya would crouch by the hole waiting for water, here for hours at a time, and for 5 long months until the rains came and she and her family could return home. Southern Sudan, 1985. Selva's eye was swollen shut. Bucks's forearms were lumpy and raw. A friend of Bucks's had a fat lip. They all looked as though they had been in a terrible fist fight, but their injuries weren't bruises. They were bee stings. A fire had been started under the tree to smoke the bees out of the hive and make them sleepy, but as Bucks and the other Jolu men removed the hive from the tree, the bees woke up and were not at all happy to discover that their home was being taken away. They expressed their unhappiness very clearly by buzzing, swarming, and stinging a lot. It was worth it, Selva thought as he touched his eye gingerly. His belly was a rounded lump stuffed full of honey and beeswax. Nothing had ever tasted so good as those pieces of honeycomb dripping with rich, luscious gold sweetness. Along with everyone else in the group, he had eaten as much as he could hold and then a little more. All around him people were licking their fingers in great satisfaction, except for one Dinka man who had been stung on his tongue. It was swollen so badly that he could not close his mouth. He could hardly swallow. Selva felt very sorry for him. The poor man couldn't even enjoy the honey. The walking seemed easier now that Selva had something in his belly. He had managed to save one last piece of honeycomb wrapped carefully in a leaf. By the end of the next day all the honey was gone, but Selva kept the beeswax in his mouth and chewed it for the memory of sweetness. The group got a little bigger with each passing day. More people joined them, people who had been walking alone or in little clusters of 2 or 3. Selva made it a habit to survey the whole group every morning and evening, searching for his family, but they were never among the newcomers. One evening, a few weeks after Selva first joined the group, he made his usual walk around the fireside, scanning every face in the hope of seeing a familiar one. Then, ouch! Selva almost lost his footing as the ground underneath him seemed to move. A boy jumped to his feet and stood in front of him. "Hey, watch where you're going. That was my hand you stepped on." The boy spoke Dinka, but with a different accent, which meant that he was not from the area around Selva's village. Selva took a step back. "Sorry, are you hurt?" The boy opened and closed his hand a few times, then shrugged. "It's all right, but you really should watch where you're going." "Sorry," Selva repeated. After a moment's silence, he turned away and began searching the crowd again. The boy was still watching him. "Your family?" he asked. Selva shook his head. "Me too," the boy said. He sighed, and Selva heard that sigh all the way to his heart. Their eyes met. "I'm Selva." "I'm Mariel." It was good to make a friend. Mariel was the same age as Selva. They were almost the same height. When they walked side by side, their strides were exactly the same length, and they always walked together now. "Do you know where we're going?" Selva asked the next morning. Mariel tilted his head up and put his hand on his brow to shade his eyes from the rising sun. "East," he said wisely. Selva rolled his eyes. "I know we're going east," he said. Anyone could tell that, but where in the east? Mariel thought for a moment. "Ethiopia," he said. "East of Sudan is Ethiopia." Selva stopped walking. "Ethiopia? That is another country. We can't walk all the way there." "We are walking east," Mariel said firmly. "Ethiopia is east." "I can't go to another country," Selva thought. "If I do, my family will never find me." Mariel put his arm around Selva's shoulders. He seemed to know what Selva was thinking, for he said, "It doesn't matter. Don't you know that if we keep walking east, we'll go all the way around the world and come right back here to Sudan? That's when we'll find our families." Selva had to laugh. They were both laughing as they started walking again, arm in arm, their strides matching perfectly. More than a month had passed since Selva had run from his school into the bush. The group was now walking in the land of the Atut people. In the Dinka language, the Atut were called the people of the lion. Their region was inhabited by large herds of antelope, wildebeest, gnus, and the lions that preyed on them. The Dinka told stories about the Atut. When an Atut person died, he came back to earth as a lion, with a great hunger for the human flesh he once had. The lions in the Atut region were said to be the fiercest in the world. Nights became uneasy. Selva woke often to the sounds of roars in the distance, and sometimes to the death squeal of an animal under a lion's claws. One morning he woke bleary-eyed after a poor sleep. He rubbed his eyes, rose, and stumbled after Mariel as they began walking yet again. "Selva?" It was not Mariel who had spoken. The voice had come from behind him. Selva turned. His mouth fell open in amazement, but he could not speak. "Selva!" A Long Walk to Water. Chapter 6. The Story So Far. Naya's family is at the lake camp, where she and her family stay for 5 months every year during the dry season. Selva turns around and his mouth opens in amazement as a voice calls out to him. Southern Sudan, 2008. Naya's family had been coming to the lake camp for generations. Naya herself had been there every year since she was born. One thing she liked about the camp was that she did not have to make the 2 long trips to the pond every day for water. But this year she realized for the first time that her mother hated the camp. They had no house and had to sleep in makeshift shelters. They could not bring most of their things, so they had to improvise for nearly every ordinary task. And for much of each day they had to dig for water. But the worst was the look on her mother's face every day when Naya's father and older brother Dep went off to hunt. Fear. Her mother was afraid. Afraid that the men in the family would run into Dinka tribesmen somewhere, that they would fight and get injured, or worse. They had been lucky all these years. No one from Naya's family had been hurt or killed by Dinka, but she knew other families in the village who had lost loved ones in this way. Naya could see the question in her mother's face every morning. Would they be lucky again, or was it now their turn to lose someone? Southern Sudan, 1985. Selva's mouth closed and opened again as if he were a fish. He tried to speak, but no sound came out of his throat. He tried to move, but his feet seemed stuck to the ground. "Selva!" the man said again, and hurried towards him. When the man was only a few steps away, Selva suddenly found his voice. "Uncle!" he cried out, and ran into the man's arms. Uncle Jawir was the younger brother of Selva's father. Selva hadn't seen him in at least 2 years, because Uncle had been in the army. "Uncle must know about the war and the fighting. Maybe he will know where our family is." But those hopes were dashed as soon as Uncle spoke. "Are you alone? Where is your family?" he asked. Selva hardly knew where to begin. It seemed like years since he had run, away from his school and into the bush. But he told his uncle everything as best he could. As Selva spoke, Uncle nodded at times or shook his head. His face became very solemn when Selva told him that he had not seen nor heard a single word of his family in all that time. Selva's voice trailed off and he lowered his head. He was so glad to see Uncle again, but it looked as if he might not be much help either. Uncle was quiet for a moment. Then he patted Selva's shoulder. "Ah, nephew," he said in a cheerful voice, "we are together now, so I will look after you." It turned out that Uncle had joined the group 3 days ago, but as there were more than 30 people traveling together, they had not found each other until now. As they began walking, Selva saw that Uncle had a gun, a rifle that he carried on a strap over one shoulder. Already, because of his army experience and because he had a gun, Uncle was seen by the group as a kind of leader. "Yes, when I left the army they let me keep my rifle," Uncle said, "so I am going to shoot us a fine meal as soon as we come across anything worth eating." Uncle was true to his word. That very day he shot a young topi, an antelope. Selva could hardly wait for it to be skinned and butchered and roasted. As the smoky, meaty aroma filled the air, he had to keep swallowing the saliva that flooded his mouth. Uncle laughed as Selva gobbled down his first piece of the meat. "Selva, you have teeth. You are supposed to use them when you eat." Selva could not reply. He was too busy stuffing another chunk of the delicious charred meat into his mouth. Even though the topi was a small one, there was more than enough meat for everyone in the group. But it did not take long for Selva to regret his haste in eating. After so many weeks of near starvation, his stomach rebelled mightily. He spent most of the night vomiting. Selva was not alone. Whenever he woke with his stomach heaving, he would hurry to the edge of the camp to vomit and find others there doing the same. At one point, Selva found himself in a line of a half a dozen people, all in an identical pose, bent over, holding their stomachs and waiting for the next wave of nausea. It might have been funny if he hadn't felt so miserable. The group continued to walk through the land of the Atut. Every day they saw lions, usually resting in the shade of small trees. Once in the distance they saw a lion chasing a topi. The topi escaped, but along the path Selva often saw the bones of prey that had not been so fortunate. Selva and Muriel still walked together, staying close to Uncle. Sometimes Uncle would walk with the other men and talk seriously about the journey. At those times Selva and Muriel would drop back respectfully, but Selva always tried to keep Uncle in sight. He also slept near Uncle at night. One day the group began walking in the late afternoon with hopes of reaching a water hole before settling down for the night, but there was no water anywhere for miles. They kept walking into the night and through the night. For 10 hours they walked, and near dawn the next morning everyone was exhausted. Uncle and the other leaders finally decided that the group had to rest. Selva took 2 steps off the path and fell asleep almost before he lay down. He did not wake until he felt Uncle's hand shaking his shoulder. As he opened his eyes he heard wailing. Someone was crying. Selva blinked away the sleepiness and looked at Uncle, whose face was very solemn. "I am sorry, Selva," Uncle said quietly. "Your friend, Muriel." Selva looked around. He should be somewhere nearby. I don't remember if he slept near me. I was so tired. Perhaps he has gone to find something to eat. Uncle stroked Selva's head as if he were a baby. "I am sorry," he said again. A cold fist seemed to grip Selva's heart. What was wrong? Where was Muriel?